The day I died, my youngest son was hosting a banquet. I know this because I heard the music through the courtyard wall as I lay on the cold flagstones of the storage cellar, the door bolted from the outside. Red lanterns, the laughter of guests, the high, sweet notes of an erhu cutting through the winter air like a blade through silk. My son, Shen Mingju, was celebrating the purchase of his third shop, the money for which I had given him, 3 months prior, from the last of my dead husband's burial gold. I had fallen in the cellar, looking for a winter robe. The door had closed behind me. When I cried out, no one came. I told myself this at first, that it was an accident, that the bolt had slid on its own, that the music was too loud, the servants too distracted, my daughter-in-law too absorbed in playing hostess to notice I had not come to the table. I told myself this for 4 hours, as the cold crept through my thin autumn robes and the tips of my fingers went numb against the stone floor. I told myself this even as the darkness grew absolute, and my breath came in smaller and smaller clouds against the black air. I stopped telling myself anything when I heard footsteps outside the door. They paused. I heard breathing. Then the footsteps moved away, slow and deliberate, back toward the warm light and the music. I recognized those footsteps. I had listened to them since the night they first stumbled across the floor of my bedroom, a toddling child of 2 summers, reaching for my sleeve. I had walked beside them for 30 years. I had memorized the particular rhythm of them, the slight drag of the left heel, the way they quickened near the kitchen, slowed near the family altar. They belonged to my youngest son. I died before dawn, curled against a crate of winter grain I would never eat, in a house I had built with my own hands and my husband's name. I died still wearing the apricot-colored hair ribbon my middle daughter had given me for my 60th birthday, 3 years ago, before she stopped visiting. I died with the names of my children on my lips, not as a curse, not even as a plea, simply as the last things I had ever truly owned. And then, between one breath and the absence of the next, something extraordinary happened. I woke up. Not in the cellar, not in the cold dark. I woke up in a bed so soft it felt like clouds, in a room smelling of fresh ink and chrysanthemum tea, sunlight pouring through silk-screened windows in long golden stripes across a lacquered floor. My body was young. I could feel it before I opened my eyes, feel the absence of the ache that had lived in my knees for 20 years, the lightness in my chest where the grief had settled like a stone. I lay still for a long moment, breathing. Then I opened my eyes and I looked at the ceiling beams above me, and I understood several things at once. I was 31 years old, or rather, I was inhabiting the body of a woman who was 31 years old, a woman I recognized the moment I sat up and caught my reflection in the bronze mirror on the lacquered stand beside the bed. That face, those eyes, the slight crease between the brows that came from frowning at account ledgers in poor light. My own face, 30 years younger. My name in this life, in this second life, was Chen Yu Rong, widow of the merchant Wei Chongbai, who had died of fever 8 months ago and left me with 3 children, Wei Mingju, age 9, Wei Lan Ting, age 6, my daughter Su Hua, age 4. We lived in a 3-courtyard house in the city of Xianfang in the prosperous Donghua prefecture, supported by the income from 2 cloth shops my late husband had built with his own labor and considerable wit. I knew this because I remembered it, because I had lived it once already. I had lived the next 30 years
once already. I sat on the edge of the bed in the early morning light, and I let the memories wash over me in their full, terrible clarity. Every compromise I had made, every sacrifice I had not recognized as sacrifice. Every morning I arose before dawn to manage the accounts so the shops would not fail. Every festival I spent sewing other people's New Year robes because my own children needed new shoes. I remembered the day Ming Ju came home with his first wife without consulting me, and I had smiled and called her daughter. I remembered the day Lan Ting told me the Western shop needed to be sold to cover a gambling debt, and I had handed over the deed, because what else does a mother do? I remembered the day Su Hua stopped writing letters, and I had told myself she was busy, and busy, and busy, until the silence became its own kind of answer.
I remembered every version of the same scene. Me giving, them taking, and the taking so gradual, so wrapped in the ordinary language of family that I had not recognized it as the slow excavation of everything I was. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed until the memories settled. Then I rose, walked to the window, and looked out at my courtyard, smaller than the one I had died in, cleaner, still in the order I maintained before the children stopped caring whether I maintained it. The plum tree in the corner was flowering early. The well had a new rope, which I had purchased and installed myself last month. The kitchen smoke was just beginning to rise. I was 31 years old. My husband was 8 months in the ground. I had 3 children who, in another life, would grow into people who bolted doors. This time, I thought, watching the plum blossoms tremble in the morning wind, I will not give them the chance. The woman I had been, the first version of Chen Yuemang, the one who died in the cellar, had made the same error every day for 30 years, and she had made it out of love. She believed that love was something you poured outward, into children, into a household, into the gap left by a dead husband, and that the pouring itself was the purpose. She had believed that if she gave enough, eventually the vessel would be full and something would be returned to her. She had been wrong. Some vessels have no floor. I am not angry at her, at my former self. She was not a foolish woman. She ran 2 cloth shops, managed 3 difficult berths with a husband who traveled frequently for trade, negotiated with suppliers who thought widows were soft targets, and learned otherwise. She was capable and clear-eyed in everything except the place where her heart lived. There she was blind in the specific way that mothers are sometimes blind, completely, devotedly, willingly. I no longer had that luxury. The first thing I did that morning in my second life was sit down at the account desk and read every ledger from the past 8 months. My late husband, Wei Chong-bai, had been a man of genuine intelligence and some sentimentality. He had left the business in good order, the accounts balanced, 2 loyal shop managers named Huang Deping and Old Chen, who had worked for him for 15 years each, and who I knew from my previous life could be trusted with careful management. In my previous life, I had leaned on them heavily in the early years, and then, as the children grew and made their opinions known, allowed them to be dismissed or sidelined in favor of arrangements that suited my sons better. Not this time. I sent for Huang Deping that same morning. He arrived expecting, I think, the usual monthly review, a polite meeting in which the widow nodded at his reports and asked careful questions about linen counts. He was a man of 50-something, gray at the temples, with the patient manner of someone who has spent many years being more competent than the people he worked for. He sat across the account table from me and placed his ledger book on the surface between us with the careful reverence of a man who respects his own work. Manager Huang, I am going to speak plainly with you, and I need you to speak plainly in return. He looked at me with the slight recalibration that crosses a face when someone behaves unexpectedly. Madam Wei, my husband valued your judgment. I have read his correspondence. I know he consulted you on the Feng Shi expansion 3 years ago and took his advice when his own instinct said otherwise. That expansion was the most profitable decision he made in the last decade. I folded my hands on the table. I intend to run this business, not to hold it in place until my sons are old enough to inherit it, not to simply preserve what my husband built. I intend to expand it. I want your honest assessment of what that requires. Huang Deping's stylus had stopped moving. He was looking at me with an expression I would come to recognize over the following months, the look of a competent person who has found competence across the table from them.
Everyone wants advice, said old Madame Fang. Most of them want permission dressed up as advice. Which is it? I considered the question honestly. Neither, I said. I want to know how you did it. Did what? Kept yourself. After. She looked at me for a long moment, a look that went somewhere past the social surface of my face into something underneath it. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her in some way, because she settled back in her chair and the formal angle of her posture loosened slightly. "You're Wei Changbai's widow," she said. "Chen Yuerong, yes. You have 3 children?" 3 children, 2 shops, 1 courtyard house, and approximately 30 more years to live, if I am fortunate. I set my hands around the tea bowl. I would like those years to be mine. Old Madame Fang smiled, not warmly exactly, but with a precision that felt warmer than warmth because it was real. "Then you're already different," she said, "from every other young widow I've watched come through this city. Most of them spend those 30 years waiting to be needed." "I know," I said. She tilted her head at the certainty in my voice. I did not explain it. Some things cannot be explained without sounding like madness, and the truth of where my certainty came from was less important than its presence. "The first thing," she said, after a pause, "is the accounts. I've already begun." "Good. The second thing is harder. The second thing is learning to be comfortable when people are disappointed in you, because they will be. Your children, your neighbors, the matchmakers who will come to discuss second marriages, the temple women who expect your time and your donations in proportion to your late husband's name, they will all expect things of you, and when you decline to give those things, they will tell you that you are cold, that you have lost your natural feeling, that you are not the woman your husband knew." She refilled her own tea with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who has made peace with silence. "You will need to let them say these things. You will need to hear them and continue anyway." "I know," I said again. This time she heard something in my voice that made her set down the teapot. "How old are you?" she asked. 31, and also very, very old." She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she laughed, a sound that startled me with its fullness, its genuine amusement, the way it erased 30 years from her face. "Come on Wednesday mornings. I'll teach you Wei Qi. You need something that belongs only to you." The first test came in the 3rd month. Mingju's maternal aunt, the sister of my late mother-in-law, a woman named Wei Peiying who had strong opinions about everything and the confidence of someone who has never been seriously wrong about anything that mattered, arrived at my gate on a morning I was reviewing the linen order with Huang Deping and announced through my housekeeper that she had come to help. I knew what help from Wei Peiying looked like. In my first life, she had moved into my guest courtyard for 4 months following my husband's death and had spent those 4 months rearranging my household according to her preferences, inserting herself into my business decisions as the representative of the Wei family interest, and very gently, very systematically undermining my authority with my own children in the name of maintaining proper Wei family standards. By the time she left, Mingju had learned that his mother's decisions could be appealed to Aunt Peiying, and this lesson had proven durable. I received her in the front parlor with tea and courtesy. "Sister Peiying, it is good to see you well."
She was a handsome woman of 50, dressed in the considered prosperity of someone who manages her appearance the way a general manages territory. She looked around my parlor with the assessing speed of someone who has refined assessment into reflex. "The children," she said. "How are they managing? Mingju especially, a boy without his father at this age. Mingju is doing very well at the Liang Academy. His teacher, Master Liang, tells me he is particularly strong in composition. Lan Ting is adjusting, slowly. Su Hua has been my companion these past months and has been a great comfort. A girl that age needs proper supervision, not to be—" "Sister Pei Ying," I said pleasantly, "I must be direct with you because I respect you and I do not want to waste either of our time. I am grateful for your care for the Wei family and for my sake, but I cannot accept your help at this time."
Children. However, I have the household well managed, and I do not have a guest room available at present. I would be delighted to have you for dinner when it is convenient. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. "The guest room," she said, "has always been currently being repainted. The east wall had a water stain from last autumn's rains that has been troubling me." I smiled. "When the work is complete, of course you must come and see the result. Your eye for these things has always been excellent." There was no water stain. There had never been a water stain. But there was also no way for Wei Pei Ying to call me a liar in my own parlor without losing considerably more face than she could afford to lose. She stayed for tea. She left before lunch. She did not, in this second version of my life, move into my guest courtyard. When she was gone, I sat in the empty parlor for a moment, feeling the unfamiliar shape of a boundary held. In my first life, I had let her in because I was afraid of her disapproval, afraid of the family's judgment, afraid of the word that follows a widow who is not accommodating enough. Cold, heartless, too proud. I was not afraid now, not because I had lost the capacity for fear, but because I had spent 30 years learning what the alternative cost, and the cost was everything. Every year I had given away to other people's comfort had been a year I did not live. Every opinion I had swallowed to keep peace had been a piece of my actual self, dissolving. I was done dissolving. It should not be thought that I became a woman without love. That is not what happened, and it would be a failure of honesty to describe it that way. I loved my children. I loved them with the same structural depth I had always loved them, the love that lives in the bone rather than the nerve, that persists beyond convenience and continues regardless of what one receives in return. That kind of love does not switch off because one has decided to live differently. It simply changes its expression. In my first life, love meant giving until I was empty. I had thought this was what love required. I had learned it from my own mother, who had learned it from hers, and so on back through the generations. This idea that a woman's love was measured by her depletion, that the more you retained for yourself, the less you were giving to your family, that self-preservation was selfishness. I no longer believed this. I began to understand in that second life that I had confused love with erasure, that the woman I had been in my first life had loved her children so thoroughly that she had ceased to exist as a person in her own right, and that this erasure, in the end, had not served anyone. My children had not grown up seeing a woman who was happy. They had grown up seeing a woman who was useful, and they had, reasonably, concluded that this is what I was for. You cannot teach people to value what you yourself treat as worthless. I was not worthless. I had never been worthless. I had simply spent 30 years acting as though I were, in the belief that this was virtue. It was not virtue. It was a slow form of vanishing, and the people who benefited from my vanishing had learned to see the vanishing as natural and the reappearing as an inconvenience. So I began to reappear, not with dramatics, not with proclamations or confrontations, simply by being present, fully present, as a person with preferences and pleasures and the right to both. I went to old Madame Fang on Wednesday mornings and learned Wei Qi.
I was at first terrible at it. She was not kind about it. She was accurate, which was considerably more useful. By the end of the first year, I could beat her 1 in 5 games. By the end of the third year, it was even. She told me I thought the way water moves, always looking for the lower path, patient past what most people can manage. I took this as the compliment I believe she intended. I took a calligraphy student, a girl of 12 whose family could not afford a proper teacher, and who I had noticed writing characters in the dust outside the Eastern shop with a stick, her face intent and completely absorbed. Her name was Mei Qiang-hu, and she was extraordinarily talented and almost completely lacking in the resources that talent requires. I taught her every Tuesday afternoon. In exchange, she helped me with the correspondence that made my hands cramp in winter. I began to visit the temple garden on the first of every month, alone, and to spend an hour there in the simple practice of doing nothing useful. These things sound small. In the architecture of a life, they were enormous. They were the difference between a life and a performance of one. In the 5th month of my second life, Mingzhu came home from school with a bruised jaw and the particular expression of a boy who knows he has done something wrong and is calculating whether disclosure or concealment is the better strategy.
In my first life, I would have cleaned the wound and asked gentle questions and waited for him to tell me when he was ready, and by the time he was ready, the incident would have been smoothed into a version that minimized his responsibility. I looked at him for a moment. "Sit down," I said. He sat. He was watching me with those quick eyes that were already so much better at reading rooms than a 9-year-old's eyes should be. "Tell me what happened," I said. "All of it. Not the version where you were the wronged party, the actual version." He was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, he told me. He had said something cruel to a younger boy, a scholarship student named Wen Chao, whose clothes were not as fine as the other boys, mocking him in front of the class for an error in recitation. Wen Chao had borne it without responding. An older boy, a merchant's son named Peng Da, had not, and had hit Mingju for it on the way home. I listened without changing my expression. "The older boy was wrong to hit you," I said when he had finished. "Violence is not a correction. But he was right to be angry." I looked at my son. "You know the name of the boy you mocked?" "Wen Chao." "He will remember this longer than you will. What you said to him is the kind of thing that stays in a person." I paused. "What will you do about it?" Mingju blinked. In my first life, I think I had never asked him this question, "What will you do?" because I had always answered it for him, with comfort, with context, with the gentle reframing that made his errors into learning moments rather than responsibilities. "I apologize?" That is a beginning. An apology must be genuine and must be made without expecting forgiveness in return. The apology is for him, not for your own relief. I rose and went to the medicine cabinet for the salve. "I will clean your jaw. You will spend this evening writing the apology, and you will deliver it tomorrow before class. And then you will consider for the rest of your time at school what it means that a boy with fewer resources than you has more character." He looked at me with those sharp eyes. I met them without flinching. "Mother," he said carefully, "you're different." "Yes," I agreed. "I am." I said nothing more. He did not ask further, but something passed between us in that moment, something that had the quality of recalibration, of a careful young person updating his model of who his mother was and what she could be counted on to overlook. He could not be counted on to overlook it. That was what I was telling him. He was 9 years old, and he was already learning to read people, and it was important that he learn to read me correctly. I was paying attention. I would always be paying attention, and I loved him too much to pretend otherwise. By the end of the first year, the Eastern shop had recovered its profit margin. The fraudulent stock buyer was gone, the Lin Jia account was restored, and Huang Deiping had hired a new fabric buyer, a woman named Chu Lan Mei,
recommended by old Madame Fong, who had an eye for quality that was genuinely extraordinary and a reputation in the textile district that opened doors. Old Chen, meanwhile, had flagged a new opportunity, the northern trading route, which my husband had explored briefly before his illness and set aside, was experiencing increased traffic from the frontier provinces. There was demand for high-quality cotton cloth among the newly wealthy merchant families in the border cities. I approved the expansion. In my first life, I had not approved it. I had waited for someone else to decide. I had told myself that I lacked the expertise, the authority, the standing to make a major business decision alone, that I should wait until Mingju was older, until the family had someone reliable to consult, until the moment felt safer. The moment had never felt safer, and in the waiting the opportunity had closed, and two of my husband's competitors had taken the northern market, and by the time my sons inherited the business was smaller than it should have been, and they had blamed the contraction on my management. I was done waiting for permission. The expansion required a capital partner, someone with northern connections and the standing to navigate the frontier market customs. Through old Madame Fong, I was introduced to a merchant family named Chow, based in the Fangxi city, who were exactly these connections and were looking for a reliable fabric supplier. The head of the Chow trading house, Chow Bo-ming, was a practical man of 40 who evaluated potential partners the way a craftsman evaluates materials, by quality, not presentation. He came to meet me expecting, I think, to be negotiating with a representative of the Wei business, a manager, a male relative, a proxy of some kind. He found me at my account desk, with the full ledger spread open before me, Huang Deping at my side, and 3 years of sales figures annotated in my own hand.
He sat across from me and we talked for 4 hours. At the end of it, he offered me terms. I counteroffered. He considered my counteroffer with the particular expression of someone who has realized they underestimated the other party and is deciding whether to be annoyed or impressed. He accepted. "Madam Wei," he said as we signed the partnership agreement, "forgive me for saying so, but you are not what I expected." "No," I agreed pleasantly, "I rarely am." He laughed. It was, I thought, the beginning of a productive association. In my first life, I had never met Jia Bomeng. The northern expansion had died with the opportunity. Everything that grew from it, the capital, the connections, the slowly expanding architecture of a business that I was building into something that could sustain me for the rest of my life without requiring my son's goodwill, had never existed. It existed now. I walked home that evening through the autumn streets, the partnership documents folded inside my sleeve, and I allowed myself something I had not allowed myself in my first life. I felt satisfied. Not grateful. Satisfaction is different from gratitude. Gratitude is what you feel when something is given to you. Satisfaction is what you feel when you have made something yourself. I had made this, with my own hands, my own judgment, my own willingness to sit across a table from strangers and speak as though my voice had the same weight as anyone else's in the room. Because it did. It always had. I had simply not believed it. The plum tree in my courtyard had finished flowering. The nights were cold with the clean, particular cold of deep autumn, and the stars above the roofline were very bright. I stood in my courtyard for a moment before going inside, and I breathed the air and I thought, this is mine. Not the house, though the house was mine. Not the business, though the business was mine. This, the breath, the decision, the life being built from the ground up in the image of what I actually was, this was mine in the deepest sense. I had died for the error of giving it away. I did not intend to make that error again. The years passed the way years pass when one is paying attention to them, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular fullness of time that is actually being used. I will not pretend they were easy years. Ease is not the correct measure. They were real years, years with friction and grief and the specific exhaustion of building something from components that have no guarantee to fit together. Years in which I made errors and corrected them, in which my children tested limits and found them,
in which the business grew in the deliberate way of something tended rather than the accidental way of something merely lucky. Mingju delivered his apology to Wen Chao. I do not know what was said. I did not ask because some things must be private to be real. What I know is that Wen Chao, the scholarship boy with better character than his clothes, became Mingju's closest friend over the following 2 years, and that this friendship was the best thing that happened to my eldest son's character in his entire education. Wen Chao was the first person in Mingju's life who did not require anything of him, not performance, not generosity, not the particular charm Mingju had learned to deploy like a tool. And in that friendship, my son, who had learned very early to read rooms and calculate returns, learned for the first time what it was to simply be somewhere without calculation. I was grateful to Wen Chao had a way I could never express without embarrassing everyone involved. Lang Ting remained the difficult one, not difficult in the way of a bad child. He was not bad in any sense that matters. He was good-hearted, genuinely, in the way that people are sometimes good-hearted who have not yet been tested. But he had learned in his early years that distress produced attention, and this lesson had settled into the deep places of his personality in a way that was very hard to reach. He would fall into helplessness at the slightest obstacle, and then look at me with those large, grieving eyes waiting for rescue. In my first life, I had rescued him. Every time, without fail, I had rescued him, until he was 36 years old and weeping at the account table about a gambling debt, and I had rescued him then too.
In this life, I did not rescue him. I sat beside him instead. The problem, I would say, is this: what might address it? The first several times he stared at me as though I had spoken in a foreign tongue. The next several times he produced solutions so inadequate I had to concentrate to keep my face still. But gradually, slowly, over months and then years, something shifted. He began to think before bringing me problems. He began to arrive not with a crisis, but with a crisis and a proposed solution. He began to experience the strange and transformative feeling of having resolved something himself, and to discover that this feeling was its own kind of satisfaction, different from and better than the relief of being rescued. He was 14 before he thanked me for it. He did not know he was thanking me. He simply said, one evening after managing a difficult negotiation with a fabric merchant on behalf of the Eastern shop, where I had sent him as my representative because I knew he was ready, even if he did not, I didn't think I could do that. He sounded surprised and quiet, the way people sound when they have discovered something about themselves that revises their self-understanding. I know, I said. Did you know I could? Yes. He looked at me for a moment. How? I thought about how to answer honestly without saying, because I watched you fail to be capable for 30 years in another life, and I understood that the failure was not in you, but in the way you were allowed to remain helpless. I said instead, because you are more than you have been shown to be. Most people are. He thought about this for a long time. I watched it work in him. Suha was from the beginning the easiest and the hardest. Easiest because she required nothing I did not genuinely want to give. She asked for attention, not sacrifice, presence, not erasure. Hardest because the mistakes I had made with her in my first life were so specifically mine, so rooted in assumptions I had carried without examining, that correcting them required examining myself in ways that were genuinely uncomfortable. I had undervalued her in my first life because she was a daughter. I had done this without ever saying so, without ever even thinking it directly, but the evidence was in every small choice. The persimmon given to Mingju, the attention directed towards the boys' schooling while her own education was treated as secondary, the way I had listened to her observations about the household with a kind of patient fondness, rather than the genuine engagement I gave her brother's observations about the business. She had known. She had always known. Children who are perceptive enough know when they are being half attended to, and they learn over years to expect it. I began attending fully. She noticed immediately, with the wariness of someone who has learned not to trust new patterns until they have held long enough to be real. She tested it, came to me with increasingly serious observations, waiting to see when I would redirect or minimize. I did not redirect or minimize.
When she told me, at age 8, that the Western shop's new location had a drainage problem that would cause flooding in the spring, and the other tenants on the street had been dealing with it for years, I took her to see the property myself, and she showed me the fault line in the courtyard stones with the absolute confidence of a person whose observations have finally been taken seriously. She was right. I renegotiated the lease accordingly. After that, she brought me everything she noticed. She noticed an extraordinary amount. By the time Suha was 12, I was consulting her on household decisions the way I consulted Wang Deping on business ones, not because I needed her input, but because the consultation itself was the point. She was learning that her thinking had weight, that her observations produced real consequences in the world, that the space between noticing something and it mattering did not have to be filled with being ignored. It was the education I had not given her in my first life. I gave it to her now, imperfectly, with the full knowledge of what I was correcting. In the 7th year of my second life, something happened that I had not anticipated, because it came from a direction I had not watched carefully enough. Old Madame Fong fell ill. Not seriously at first, a winter cough that deepened into something that settled in her chest and refused to leave. She reduced her Wai Chi mornings and did not tell me why until I arrived one Wednesday to find her in bed rather than at the game table, her face thinner than I had seen it, her breathing audible before I crossed the room. "It looks worse than it is," she said, in the tone of someone who has decided what they believe and will not be argued with. "It may look exactly as bad as it is," I said, sitting down beside the bed. "What does the physician say?" "He says I am old." I told him I was aware of this and asked whether he had anything more specific to offer. He did not. She looked at me with those sharp, dark eyes that illness had not yet dimmed. "You're worried."
Yes. You have never told me that before, that you were worried. I have not needed to. You have always appeared invincible. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. I am not invincible. I am experienced. These are different things, though the symptoms can be similar. She was quiet for a moment. Sit with me, not as a caretaker, as yourself. I sat with her. We did not play Wei Qi. We talked about things we had not talked about in 7 years of Wednesday mornings, because Wednesday mornings had been the practice of skill, the exchange of practical wisdom, the economy of 2 competent women who respected each other enough to not require tenderness. We talked now about her husband, who she had loved genuinely and mourned genuinely and released genuinely into the ground, all 3 things done completely. We talked about her sons, who were adequate men she had managed not to resent for their adequacy. We talked about what she had wanted to be before she was what she became, and whether the distance between those 2 things had ever stopped troubling her. "Less than you might expect," she said. "More than I would like." She looked at the window, where the winter light was the particular thin silver of a cold afternoon. "You know what I regret most?" "Tell me." "That I waited. After Fong died, I waited 2 years before I allowed myself to build anything. I was afraid of what people would say. A widow who builds things for herself? A woman who has opinions about her own money? I knew what they would say, and I waited, and those 2 years, I cannot recover them." She turned back to look at me. "You did not wait." "No, I did not." "How did you know not to?" I thought about the cellar, the cold, the footsteps outside the door. I thought about the music from the banquet, the erhu cutting the winter air, my son's particular footstep moving away. I was shown the cost, very clearly, by someone who had already paid it. She watched me with those old, sharp eyes, and I think she understood something in my answer that I had not quite said. She did not ask further. She only nodded, the small nod of someone who recognizes a complete truth, even when its form is slightly oblique. "Good," she said. "Then don't stop." She recovered that winter, slowly, imperfectly, with a cough that lingered into spring, and a new economy of energy that she did not like but managed with the same precise competence she brought to everything. She returned to Wei Qi in the 3rd month, thinner than before, and beat me 3 games straight to demonstrate that illness had not impaired her thinking. I let her win none of them. She looked at me across the board afterward with an expression I had never seen on her face before, uncomplicated warmth. "You're the only person who plays me honestly," she said. "You would not respect me if I did otherwise." "No," she agreed, "I would not." The first true test came when Mingju was 17. He came to me in the evening study, where I was reviewing the Northern Route accounts with Huang Deping's latest report. He stood in the doorway with that particular posture at his, the careful, deliberate posture of someone who has decided what they want before they have decided how to ask for it, and is now calculating the most effective approach. I had seen this posture for 8 years. I recognized it the way one recognizes weather. "Sit down," I said, without looking up from the accounts. He sat. I finished the paragraph I was reading, not to make him wait, but because the paragraph required finishing, and then I set the report aside and gave him my full attention. "I want to withdraw from the Liang Academy," he said. In my first life, he had not asked. In my first life, he had simply stopped attending at 17, and I had discovered this through a letter from Master Liang that arrived while Mingju was out gambling with the sons of merchant families who had more money than discipline, and by then the situation was already solid, already decided, and I had wept and capitulated, because what else does a mother do when the door is already closed? He had asked this time. That was already different. I had taught him something without realizing I was teaching it, that I was someone worth asking. "Why?" I said. "The academy is for scholars. I am not going to be a scholar. I am going to run a business." He leaned forward slightly, the way he always did when he was about to deploy the charm. "Mother, I am already managing the Western shop accounts better than Deping's assistant, and everyone knows it. What I learn in the academy I will never use. What I need to learn is what you are doing. The trade decisions, the partnerships, the negotiation. Why should I sit in a classroom learning poetry when I could be learning that?" It was, I recognized, a reasonably good argument. It was also not entirely the argument he was making, because Mingju rarely made entirely the argument he was making. "You mentioned Win Chao will continue at the academy," I said, "for 2 more years, after which he plans to sit the provincial examinations." Mingju was briefly still. "Yes. You and Win Chao have studied together for 8 years. If you leave the academy now, you will see each other much less." I kept my voice entirely neutral. "I wonder if that consideration entered your thinking." The stillness lasted a moment longer. Then something honest crossed his face, something he usually kept better hidden, the genuine feeling below the calculated surface. "Win Chao has his path," he said. "I have mine." "Yes," I agreed. "The question is whether you are choosing your path or avoiding his." He met my eyes. I met his. He looked away first. "I don't know," he said. And this, finally, was the real thing, the admission underneath the argument, the uncertainty below the certainty he had carried into the room. "I don't know which it is." "Then you should find out before you make an irreversible decision." I picked up the Northern accounts again. "Stay at the academy for 1 more year. During that year, you will also spend 2 mornings each week at the Eastern shop learning the accounts from Deping directly. At the end of the year, if you still wish to withdraw, we will discuss it as an informed choice rather than an instinctive one." He was quiet. "Then, what if I disagree with the arrangement?" "Then you tell me so, and explain your reasoning, and we discuss it." I looked at him steadily. "That is how decisions are made in this household. You have a voice, and I am interested in it. You do not, however, have unilateral authority, because you are 17 and this is still my house and my business, and I have a responsibility to ensure that your choices, which will affect your life for 50 more years, are made from information rather than emotion." He looked at me for a long moment. In his eyes, I could see the calculation happening, the familiar reading of the room, the assessment of leverage, the mapping of exits. And then, gradually, I saw something else. The moment when the calculation ran its course and arrived at a conclusion that surprised him. He had no leverage. Not because I had taken it from him, but because he had never actually had it, and the version of reality in which he did had been a story his previous mother had been too afraid to correct. 1 year, he said. 1 year, I agreed. He left.
I sat for a moment in the quiet of the study, with the accounts on my desk and the lamp burning and the winter dark outside the window. I thought about my eldest son as he was now, 17, sharp, calculating, capable of selfishness and genuine feeling, and I thought about the man he had been in my first life, the one who had come home from the banquet to bolt the cellar door. He was not that man yet. He might never be that man. The distance between them was not inevitable. It was the accumulated weight of choices, his and mine, and in this life those choices were being made differently. I did not know how he would turn out. That was the thing I had to sit with, and it was harder than it sounds, not knowing after having known. I had the map of one future, and it was a future I was working every day to prevent, but I could not simply will a different future into being. I could only make different choices and raise children who made different choices, and trust that the architecture of those choices would support something better than what I had lived. Trust is a difficult thing when you already know what betrayal looks like in its final form. I picked up the accounts and went back to work. Mingzhu stayed the year, and then another, and then completed his full education at the Liang Academy. Wen Xiao sat the provincial examinations, passed with the second highest score in the district, and was offered a clerk's position in the prefectural administration. Mingzhu saw him off with the genuine, uncalculated expression of someone losing something real, and I watched from the courtyard gate and did not say anything because some moments require silence to preserve their honesty. He joined the business at 19, as I had planned. He was, I discovered, genuinely talented in ways that had nothing to do with charm. He could look at a trade arrangement and see its pressure points the way an architect sees structural weakness. He could read a supplier's hesitation before the hesitation formed words. He could negotiate with a stillness that reminded me, sometimes uncomfortably, of myself. I taught him, carefully, with attention to what I was teaching and what I was not, because the same talent that made him good at business also made him potentially dangerous to anyone who depended on him, and I intended that anyone who depended on him would not find him dangerous. The shop manager who shorted the Southern Silk order last month, he named the man, a new hire at the Eastern shop who had been giving me a slight unease I had not yet been able to specify. He is reselling the excess to a competitor in the Western Quarter. I have documentation.
I looked at him. How long have you known? 3 months. Why did you wait 3 months to tell me? He met my eyes. I was confirming I did not want to damage a man's livelihood on suspicion. I held the look for a moment. Something in my chest moved, not quite pride, something quieter and deeper than pride. Show me the documentation, I said. He placed it on the table. It was thorough, methodical, specific, not the work of someone who had been building a case for power, the work of someone who had been being careful. We dismissed the shop manager. The dismissal was handled cleanly. I did it, not Mingzhu, because I wanted to make clear where authority lived, and we replaced him with one of Q Lan Mei's recommendations, a young man from Fengxi with excellent references and no interesting relatives. Afterward, Mingzhu said, I would have handled the dismissal. I know, I said. You didn't trust me to. I didn't give you the opportunity. Those are different things. I looked at him. You are very good at this, Mingzhu, better, possibly, than I am in certain areas. That is genuinely true, and I am genuinely glad of it. But you are 21, and I am 42, and authority in this business transfers when I choose to transfer it, not when talent suggests it should. Do you understand the distinction? A long pause. Yes, he said. And then, after another pause, in a different register, was this how grandfather treated father? It was not a question I had expected. I thought about my late husband, about Wei Changbai, who had been a fair and capable man with a genuine warmth underneath his practicality, who had left his business in order because he respected the work he had built. Your grandfather trusted your father very early, possibly earlier than was wise. Your father was excellent, but he had certain gaps in his understanding of other people that took time to close because he had not had to earn the closing of them. Mingzhu was quiet, absorbing this.
I am not holding authority from you as a punishment, I am holding it as preparation. A man who has had to be patient, who has had to demonstrate his judgment over time to someone who is genuinely watching, becomes a different kind of leader than a man who was given authority because he was talented and convenient. He left without responding, but I noticed, in the months that followed, that he had heard me. It was Lan Ting who brought the first real crisis. He was 23, managing a small textile import account I had given him as his own responsibility, genuinely his, with real decisions and real consequences, and no safety net beneath him except his own competence, which had been quietly growing in the way that competence grows when it is required rather than optional. He had been doing well, satisfyingly well, in this specific way of watching someone discover that they are more capable than they believed. Then the crisis arrived in the form of a man named Bao Cheng-gui. Bao Cheng-gui was a trader from the southern coast, charming in the aggressive way of people who use charm as their first weapon, and he arrived in Shifeng with a proposition that sounded on its surface like an excellent opportunity, a new sea route for imported cotton from the far south, significantly cheaper per bolt than our current suppliers, available exclusively to merchant families willing to invest in the initial shipment. He came to Lan Ting specifically, not to me, not to Mingju, to Lan Ting, because Lan Ting was 23 and slightly soft still around the edges of his judgment, and because people like Bao Cheng-gui are very good at finding the right door. In my first life, Lan Ting had lost 1,200 taels to a scheme very similar to this one. In my first life, I had covered the loss and said nothing, because what else does a mother do when her son is standing in her study weeping? In this life, Lan Ting came to me himself before he had committed anything. He came in the evening with the Bao Cheng-gui documents under his arm and the careful expression of someone who already knows the answer to the question they are about to ask. He placed the documents on my desk. I did not reach for them. "Tell me what you think," I said. He sat down. He was quiet for a moment, the way he always was now when he was genuinely thinking rather than performing thinking. "The price is too good," he said. "Go on." "Sea routes from the far south take 4 months minimum. The storage costs alone for a shipment that size would cut significantly into the margin he's quoting. The numbers only work if the goods never arrive. Or if they arrive but are not what was ordered. Third possibility, if the investment money disappears before the ship is ever loaded."
He looked at the documents without touching them. He said, I almost said yes. He was very persuasive. He is designed to be persuasive. That is his occupation. I looked at my second son, at the face that still carried something of the anxious boy he had been, overlaid now with something that was becoming, slowly and genuinely, its own kind of quiet strength. "What stopped you?" He met my eyes. I thought, what question would mother ask that I don't yet have the answer to? And when I started looking for the answer, I found the problem. I held his gaze for a moment. "You did not need me to be in the room." "No," he said slowly. "I suppose I didn't." "You have never needed me in the room," I said. "You have needed to believe that you could think clearly without me there. These are different deficits, and you have been closing the second one for several years." I picked up the Bao Cheng-gui documents and placed them in the drawer where I kept things to be returned to their senders. I will write to the prefectural trade office about Bao Cheng-gui. He will find this market less hospitable after that letter. "Should I have come to you sooner?" "No. You should have come when you were ready to think clearly about it, which is when you came." I looked at him. "Lan Ting, you trusted yourself. I need you to understand what that means, not as a statement about this situation, but as information about who you are becoming. You trusted your own thinking over a persuasive stranger's pressure. That is not a small thing. It is in fact the thing that took me the longest to learn myself." He looked startled. the look of someone who has been told something true and not yet decided what to do with it. You? I also once confused a persuasive argument with a sound one, I said, multiple times, over many years. I stood and went to the window, where the evening had gone the deep blue of late spring, the stars just beginning. The difference between us is that you are learning this at 23, and I learned it later. You will have more years to use the knowledge. He was quiet for a long time. When I turned back from the window, he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen from him in my first life and did not quite have a name for, something that held gratitude and recognition and a kind of grief for something he could not precisely identify. "Mother," he said, "were you happy in these years?" The question surprised me. I stood with it for a moment, genuinely considering it, which is the only honest way to answer questions that deserve honesty. "Yes," I said, "I have been. Not always, not completely, but yes." I paused. "Were you?" He blinked. The question clearly had not occurred to him as returnable. He thought about it the way I had taught him to think about things that mattered. "I think I'm starting to be," he said. Suha was 20 when she came to tell me she had been offered a position. The position was not the kind that women in Xiangfeng were offered generally, a teaching role at a newly established women's academy in the provincial capital, 2 days' travel from home. The academy had been founded by a progressive magistrate's wife with money from 3 merchant families and a mandate from the prefecture to establish formal education for daughters of the merchant class. They needed a calligraphy teacher and an instructor in household accounts, someone who could teach young women to manage numbers. Mei King-her, my former calligraphy student, now grown and brilliant and working as a clerk at a law office in the capital, had recommended Suha without telling her she was doing so. Suha placed the letter on my desk with both hands, and the expression of someone who has already decided what they want and is bracing to be told they cannot have it. I read the letter. "Congratulations," I said. She stared at me. "I haven't told you I want to go." You placed the letter with both hands. You have been practicing that sentence, "I have been offered a position," because you rehearse things when you are nervous about how they will be received. You are wearing your good jacket, which you put on when you want to feel solid, and you decided to come to me in the evening rather than the morning because you thought I would be less likely to react with immediate concern after a productive day. I set the letter down. You want to go. I can see every word of that in how you are standing. She exhaled, a long, complicated exhale that had relief and something like tears somewhere inside it. You thought I would say the capital is too far. It is far. It is also an extraordinary opportunity, and you are exactly the right person for it, and Mei King-her was right to recommend you. I looked at my daughter, at the person she had become, the one I had missed the building of in my first life and had watched carefully and with full attention in this one. She was sharp and observant, and possessed of a quiet confidence that had been built rather than born, because I had helped build it, because this time I had understood that building it was the point. "You will write weekly." "Every week," she agreed.
You will come home for the winter festival, every year, and you will tell me if you are unhappy, because unhappiness is not something to manage quietly until it becomes something worse. She looked at me for a moment. I saw in her face the particular expression of a person who is being genuinely seen and is still slightly surprised by it, even after years of it. "I know," she said. "You taught me that." "I am teaching myself as well," I said. "We are doing it together." She came around the desk and embraced me, not the dutiful embrace of a child performing filial piety, but the real thing, the sudden, uncalculated warmth of a person who loves and is not afraid to show it because she has not been taught to fear the showing. I held her and felt the weight of everything that was different in this life, everything that had been given a second chance to grow correctly. "Go. Do something the world doesn't expect you to do. Report back." She left in the spring. The courtyard felt different without her. Not empty,
different, the way a room feels different when a window is opened, larger and with more air moving through it. The moment that I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting arrived in my 22nd year, on the morning of the Winter Lantern Festival, when Mingzhu came to my study with a particular expression I had not seen on his face since he was 9 years old and bruised. He was 31, the same age I had been when this second life began. He was by now the managing partner of the Northern trading operation, which had grown well past what I had imagined in those first careful months with Zhao Boming. We supplied 4 prefectures, we had 3 partnerships and 2 exclusive accounts with frontier guilds, and the Wei business was considered among the most stable merchant houses in Donghua Prefecture. He was known for being exacting and fair and very difficult to deceive. He had, in the end, become something I had not dared to hope for in those first cautious years, a genuinely good businessman and a genuinely decent man. But the expression he was wearing was the expression of a 9-year-old with a bruised jaw. "Sit down," I said. He sat. He placed his hands on his knees with the particular stillness of someone holding themselves through effort. "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else." "Then tell me." He told me. He had made an error, a significant one, in judgment rather than arithmetic. A young man he had brought into the northern operations 6 months ago, the son of a Fengshi merchant family he respected, had been exploiting a gap in the account oversight to divert small amounts to a side arrangement. Mingzhu had noticed the pattern, had begun investigating, and in the process of investigating had discovered that he had hired this young man partly because he reminded him of Wen Shao, had hired him for sentimental reasons he had not acknowledged to himself, and had given him more trust than the evidence warranted because of those reasons. The loss was recoverable. The embarrassment was genuine. He looked at me when he finished, with the 9-year-old's eyes inside the 31-year-old's face, waiting for the response. "What did you learn?" I asked. A pause. "That I am not free of sentiment as I believed. No one is. The question is not whether sentiment influences your judgment, it always will, but whether you know when it is doing so." I looked at him steadily. "You caught it. The loss is recoverable. The lesson is permanent. I should have come to you when I first noticed something was wrong." "Yes," I agreed, "you should have. You waited because you wanted to be certain, and also because you did not want me to know you had erred. These are 2 different reasons, and only one of them is good." I kept my voice level because this was the moment for levelness. The shame of an error is not a reason to delay correcting it. The shame is yours to carry. The correction is owed to everyone else. He nodded slowly. Then he said something I had not anticipated. Did you ever think when we were young that we would disappoint you this badly?" The question landed with its full weight. I was quiet for a moment. I thought about my first life, about the 30 years of giving and the giving going unnoticed, and the door bolted and the cold. I thought about what I believed in those years about disappointment, that it was something done to you by other people, that it arrived from outside and lodged in the chest and stayed. "I have never been disappointed in who you are," I said. "I have been disappointed sometimes in what you chose. Those are different things." I paused. "When you were 9 years old, you
Mocked a boy for having less than you, and then you apologized to him, genuinely, and became his friend for 8 years. I have thought about that often over the years, because it is the whole story of your character, in 2 acts. I looked at my son. You are capable of the cruelty and the apology. What I have tried to do all these years is make sure the apology was not merely strategic. He was very still. "Is it?" I asked. "Today, coming to tell me before I heard it elsewhere, Was that strategy or conscience? A long silence, long enough to be real. Conscience, he said. Mostly. Mostly conscience, I repeated, with the fraction of a smile that the moment allowed. Mostly conscience in a person who started with mostly strategy is remarkable progress. The festival lanterns that evening were red and gold against a sky that had gone the deep, clear black of a winter night with no cloud between the stars and the earth. I walked through the festival streets with old Madame Fang, who was 82 and still walked, though with a cane she had finally consented to carry, and we watched the lanterns float up from the river bridge with the slow, improbable grace of burning things that have learned to rise. "How are your children?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Complicated. Themselves." I watched a red lantern clear the bridge railing and begin to climb. "Good. And you?" I considered the question the way I had learned to consider it, fully, without deflecting into what was useful or appropriate to say, the way I had deflected for 30 years in my first life. I was 53. My business was sound and growing. My eldest son was becoming the man I had worked for 22 years to help him become. My second son managed his own account with the careful competence of someone who has learned that competence is available to him. My daughter was in the provincial capital, teaching young women to read their own ledgers, sending letters every week full of observations so specific and sharp they made me laugh out loud in the quiet of my study. Old Madame Fang was beside me, still sharp, still honest, still the most valuable company I had found in either of my lives. The plum tree in my courtyard would flower in 6 weeks. I had built this from a cellar floor, from a cold and dark that I had died inside of and been given back from the 30 years of knowledge that had been the only thing I carried into this second chance. I had built this. "I am happy," I said. And the truth of it, after all these years, still had the quality of surprise. Not the surprise of something unexpected, but the surprise of something you have worked toward for so long that its arrival does not feel entirely real. A lantern rose above the others, climbing faster than the rest, until it was a point of light among the stars and indistinguishable from them. "Good," said old Madame Fang in her precise way. "It suits you." We walked home through the festival streets, the lanterns burning above us, and I did not think about my first life, the cold, the music, the footsteps. I had thought about it enough. I had used it. I had let it teach me everything it had to teach me, and I had built something from the teaching that I would not have built without it, and the something I had built was mine. I had died in a cellar, in a house I had built with my own hands, having given everything I had to people who could not see it. I had been returned, and what I had built in the returning was not an argument, not a revenge, not a proof of anything to anyone who had ever underestimated me. It was simply a life, full, warm, specific, mine. The life I had been owed from the beginning and had finally, in my second chance at it, been wise enough to claim. The lanterns burned above the city, and the night was cold and clear, and I walked home to my own house, in my own city, with my own history in my bones, and 30 more years ahead of me, and I was, at last, entirely myself.
Mocked a boy for having less than you, and then you apologized to him, genuinely, and became his friend for 8 years. I have thought about that often over the years, because it is the whole story of your character, in 2 acts. I looked at my son. You are capable of the cruelty and the apology. What I have tried to do all these years is make sure the apology was not merely strategic.
He was very still. "Is it?" I asked. "Today, coming to tell me before I heard it elsewhere, was that strategy or conscience?" A long silence, long enough to be real. "Conscience," he said. "Mostly." "Mostly conscience," I repeated, with the fraction of a smile that the moment allowed. Mostly conscience in a person who started with mostly strategy is remarkable progress. The festival lanterns that evening were red and gold against a sky that had gone the deep, clear black of a winter night with no cloud between the stars and the earth. I walked through the festival streets with old Madame Fang, who was 82 and still walked, though with a cane she had finally consented to carry, and we watched the lanterns float up from the river bridge with the slow, improbable grace of burning things that have learned to rise. "How are your children?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Complicated. Themselves." I watched a red lantern clear the bridge railing and begin to climb. "Good." "And you?" I considered the question the way I had learned to consider it, fully, without deflecting into what was useful or appropriate to say, the way I had deflected for 30 years in my first life. I was 53. My business was sound and growing. My eldest son was becoming the man I had worked for 22 years to help him become. My second son managed his own account with the careful competence of someone who has learned that competence is available to him. My daughter was in the provincial capital, teaching young women to read their own ledgers, sending letters every week full of observations so specific and sharp they made me laugh out loud in the quiet of my study. Old Madame Fang was beside me, still sharp, still honest, still the most valuable company I had found in either of my lives. The plum tree in my courtyard would flower in 6 weeks. I had built this from a cellar floor, from a cold and dark that I had died inside of and been given back from the 30 years of knowledge that had been the only thing I carried into this second chance. I had built this. "I am happy," I said. And the truth of it, after all these years, still had the quality of surprise. Not the surprise of something unexpected, but the surprise of something you have worked toward for so long that its arrival does not feel entirely real. A lantern rose above the others, climbing faster than the rest, until it was a point of light among the stars and indistinguishable from them. "Good," said old Madame Fang in her precise way. "It suits you." We walked home through the festival streets, the lanterns burning above us, and I did not think about my first life, the cold, the music, the footsteps. I had thought about it enough. I had used it. I had let it teach me everything it had to teach me, and I had built something from the teaching that I would not have built without it, and the something I had built was mine. I had died in a cellar, in a house I had built with my own hands, having given everything I had to people who could not see it. I had been returned, and what I had built in the returning was not an argument, not a revenge, not a proof of anything to anyone who had ever underestimated me. It was simply a life, full, warm, specific, mine. The life I had been owed from the beginning and had finally, in my second chance at it, been wise enough to claim. The lanterns burned above the city, and the night was cold and clear, and I walked home to my own house, in my own city, with my own history in my bones, and 30 more years ahead of me, and I was, at last, entirely myself.